Hey y'all, as always, if you want to support this channel, you can always go to patreon.com/tawahado. You can also go to aksum.substack.com, and I see increasingly people are doing so. I've added a new way to support, which is joining the channel directly as a wattadder, which is $1 a month, a jagana, $5 a month, or as a makkar, which is $25 a month. And there are explanations in English in parentheses when you get there. Today, I want to review Dan Carlin's hardcore history episodes about King of Kings, Volume 1 and 2. I had recently finished his Supernova, and I pulled a little bit of a Tarantino by rewinding back to some of his older content before it goes behind the paywall. At the same time, I've bought some of his stuff behind the paywall, especially like the Mongols. I've heard him talk basically, for like 20 hours on World War II. I don't know, 10 or 15 hours regarding the Munsters, I think they're called, the Anabaptist history of Germany. And most recently, I've been going through this ancient history. And I'm a fan of everything. I'm a fan of everything history related, especially he particularly focuses on military history, which is most closely related to political science or political history. Ziriab Jamal, salam, wa alaikum salam, or salam and damanna. So I'm interested in this ancient history, and I want to draw some connections for those of you who have maybe read the works of neocameralism or formalism and wanted to see if there were any connections. I want to pose this idea or this question. Is it that Dan Carlin has read the neocameralists and the formalists, or is it that the formalists and the neocameralists have listened to or heard, possibly read his book, Dan Carlin, or is it that both of these groups have an interest in the ancient past and have uniquely come to the same ideas without having necessarily influenced each other? So if you go to Volume 1 of his King of Kings under Dan Carlin's hardcore history, you get a lot of different empires, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Akkadians. Eventually you get to the Persians, who are running the show a little bit differently. And everyone is, relatively brutal if you compare it to the modern day, but these seem to be the most tolerant. And one of the people who ushers in this tolerance is Cyrus the Great. And the transition in his part 1 to part 2. In part 1, I thought about the connection a little bit with neocameralism and formalism, but part 2 really brought it to the forefront by saying, you know what? After Cyrus, there was some funny business with his 2 sons and the way in which they died, and in the way in which their deaths led to Darius or Darius the Great, who's another one of these huge figures, larger than life figures. And then it clicked for me when he began using certain key terms. So Dan Carlin refers to Cyrus the Great's ushering in of a more tolerant Near Eastern empire that is centralized in the sense that Persia ruled over all these people, but decentralized in the sense that they let a lot of the people retain their own religions, their own traditions, and their own customs. And he referred to this as Cyrus being the head of the Ford Company. So the empire or the nation state, he compared to the Ford Company. And then he said that the naysayers of Darius the Great, who again gets to power through some potential subterfuge after the mysterious deaths of 2 of Cyrus's sons, is said to be called a shopkeeper. But he says if you look at the territory of his shop, it encompasses this large Near Eastern empire, the Persian Empire at the time, all the way from the Balkans, the modern day Balkans, to modern day Pakistan and India. And if you look at that territory and call him a shopkeeper, it's inappropriate. So he says maybe a better translation for the modern speaker would be CEO. And CEO of what? CEO of Walmart. He continues to talk about how Darius had 6 co-conspirators, 7 thus in total, who are doing a coup. And in their coup, he says that they are forming a new aristocracy within the pre-existing aristocracy. So he says that the children of these people keep intermarrying. They take all these high positions of power, and then their children and their children's children form a new oligarchical class. Are you following me? I hope you're making the connections. And finally, he talks about how even Herodotus, right, one of the first historians of the world from the Greek tradition, as he starts to move towards the Peloponnesian War, is one of the early naysayers of the nascent democracy from the city-states in Greece. And in comparing the decision-making processes of, let's say, Athens, which was a democracy, to Sparta, which was a monarchy, he thinks perhaps that monarchy is able to fend off against bad decision-making or poor decision-making than democracy. So you tell me, who is influencing who? Anyway, go check out Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. No money that he gives me, just really awesome ancient history to check out. And tell me if you see the connections that I have seen and laid out today. I haven't heard anyone else make these connections, and I really would be curious to see who's connected to who. Dan Carlin is very interesting politically as well. He likes to skirt the normal left and right descriptors and say he's more a man of Jeffersonian democracy. I've heard also Clay Jenkinson of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, who I especially listened to while I used to live in North Dakota because he's based in North Dakota. And I think I found out about his channel through someone, maybe a professor at the University of North Dakota while I was there. Okay, Zariab bookmarked the video, and Brian says he loves Dan Carlin. Yeah, I do too. So I would probably identify in some sense as that too, but you got to emphasize the Black Jeffersonian Democrat because the issue of slavery is obviously the biggest issue that Thomas Jefferson has. But just an interesting overall question to ponder: who is influencing who between Dan Carlin and the neocameralists and the formalists, or vice versa, or is it just happenstance that people come to the same ideas by engaging with ancient history and modern history and just digging through old books? I'm not familiar with Russell Gurmkin. Sorry, Zariab. I don't know if you could say a little bit more on that. I'm not familiar with that model. Zariab, you have anything to say on Russell Gurmkin? I could try to answer if you paint a better picture. Other than that, we can head out for today and keep this review short. Give him about 30 seconds to respond. If not, I'll head out and let the audience determine what is the nature of these connections. Am I just seeing coincidence and happenstance, or is there some intentionality behind what I'm presenting? No matter what you think, it's an interesting history to learn about, especially the Aksumite Empire in Ethiopia was controlling large parts of the Arabian Peninsula around what is modern-day Yemen and probably the southern parts of Saudi Arabia until the Sassanid Persian Empire pushed it back in, I think, the 6th century, in the 500s, back to the coast of Africa. So back to crossing the Red Sea and returning to the Horn of Africa. And after that period with the rise of Islam, the Aksumites got cut off from a lot of the world. And this is where people kind of refer to the Ethiopian Dark Ages. I don't really like that, but it's a time where the Aksumites or the Ethiopians started building their own traditions in their own local environments as much as they can, because they overexpanded without having a strong connection. They were overpowered and they had to return to what they could tangibly control. And I think history is a cycle of this expansion and contraction of empires. So it's interesting to study the early great kind of people of Persia that eventually leads to the Sassanid Empire that pushed the Aksumite Empire back. Everyone in the Ethiopian community quotes the great Persian philosopher Mani as well, the founder of Manichaeism, who says, the four great empires of the world are Abyssinia or Aksum or Ethiopia, and Rome and Persia and China. So there's a lot of connections between Persia and Ethiopia. My best friend's also Persian, so I know a little bit of Farsi, and the Persians also, through their tolerance, used a lot of Aramaic. And Aramaic is a language that is very closely related to Ge'ez and Amharic, two languages on my heart. I see Zariab came back. He says he basically proposes a Septuagint priority model instead of the documentary hypothesis model. I think you're talking about biblical formation. I'm not quite sure what that means in regards to the context we're talking about today. Ender piped in. He said, I always have to get on Google Earth when I hear stuff like this. It's good to get a visual. It's good to get a visual to see how everything is related to each other and close to each other. And like I said, the Persian Empire at the time is very vast, from the modern day Balkans, right? All the way east to India and Pakistan, right? From the former Yugoslavia to India. That's a huge swath of land. To the north, they're bordered by the Scythians and all the central Eurasians, people like the far east end, you have the Mongols. More center, you have the Kazakhs, and more west towards the Balkans, you have the Scythians or the Scythians, who are mentioned in the Bible as well. Towards the south, as I said, they eventually encroached on the Ethiopian territories that were in the Arabian Peninsula. Oh, I see. Ziryab is saying who influenced who. Yeah, a lot of these things take research to see what is the exact way in which these influences happened, and it's very difficult to decide. But we'll have a lot of time to keep doing research. I encourage you all to do your own research, and I'll head out for today. But I do encourage you to check out Hardcore History on King of Kings, Volume 1 and 2, on Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great, but also about all these Near Eastern empires, and to eventually think about a little bit later in history, because this is about 1,000 years later, that after all these dynasties, about 1,000 years later is when they encroach on the Aksumite territory. But this is kind of all the buildup that happened that made them figures and that made them influential in the area.